So welcome to our final session and the roundtable, the closing roundtable of our conference. My name is Olga Litvyak, so Dr. Olga Litvyak, I'm always forgetting that part. So I'm your chair and moderator for today, and we have a very nice lineup of people who were so kind to agree and talk to us about the Euroscepticism in the European Union and Rise of Euroscepticism. So the first one is Dr. Andreea Nastase, who is an assistant professor here in Maastricht at FASOS, which was so kind to host us here. And she has a PhD from the Central European University and also an MA degree in public policy from the same university, and works on issues of public ethics, integrity in the context and Romanian chapter of Transparency International as well. So she has a lot of experience on Eastern Europe as well, as we talked here for the last 2 days. I think it's one of the very important topics for most of you, and we heard a lot. So now we will have some more expertise in this field. Our second speaker is Dr. Benjamin Larouff, who is an assistant professor in politics and society. And he specializes a lot also in democratic innovations and Euroscepticism and comparative welfare policy. And he has his PhD from University of Edinburgh and LM in European law from the University of Kent. So he co-authored a lot of research on Euroscepticism. So I hope we will have a lot of interesting insights from your side as well. And the last but not least is our generous host as well, who helped a lot of the organization of the conference here. It's Patrick Bijsmans, he is from Maastricht, and also an associate professor here, a well-known blogger to lots of UASIS community scholars, also specializing in different topics, including Euroscepticism, but also doing a lot on teaching and learning. And he also co-authored some research on Euroscepticism. So we have quite a lot of interesting people here. And of course, lots of you who talked about these topics and mentioned the topics in the last 2 days. So I will pose a couple of questions to our speaker first, and then you will have a chance to ask your own questions. And as we are talking about Euroscepticism, I think now the timing couldn't be better with the recent French elections. Then we saw again that the radical right parties are on the rise and even compromising the democratic institutions. So what would be your take on the reasons why we are seeing it more and more and we see the rise of Euroscepticism in the European Union? Who wants to go first?
I wouldn't know where to start.
I mean, yeah, there are a lot, obviously, of issues to discuss, but I think I might start actually with the most recent French legislative elections, given that you, Olga, mentioned this, which came a little bit as a surprise to most observers of French politics, the fact that the Rassemblement National, so Marine Le Pen's party, got so many seats in the French National Assembly. The issue of European integration, however, in the context of this legislative election was a bit of a non-issue, in contrast with what we've seen in 2017, when in the context of the French presidential elections, the voters had a clear choice between two competing visions on European integration and globalization more broadly. Either you go with Macron as the pro-globalization social liberal candidate, or you go for a completely different option, protectionist, nationalist, Eurosceptic stance that it was the one from Marine Le Pen, although her stance and her party's stance has always been incredibly fuzzy. Over the past 20 years, the Front National and then Rassemblement National have always adapted their stances based on how public opinion was thinking of the European Union. I always recall, for instance, well, we are 6 years ago, as you know, and it was probably discussed yesterday too during the plenary. We woke up finding out that the UK had left the European Union, had voted to leave the European Union, that is, given that it was a very long process that we're still digesting. Difficult. But the day after, so actually 6 years ago today, Marine Le Pen had a press conference with a big poster behind her saying, now it's time for France to vote for Brexit. They tried to capitalize on Brexit, and clearly we see that the UK leaving the European Union has not become a model for Eurosceptics too. So what's interesting, and we see this in France, we see this in other countries as well, is that Eurosceptic movements have tried to find different ways to capitalize on their Euroscepticism and have moved away from the traditional hard Eurosceptic take that is, we need to leave the European Union. Most traditionally hard Eurosceptic parties now, and that's the case of the Rassemblement National, for instance, want to reform the European Union from within without leaving it. So it's back also to the initial ideas of creating a Europe of nations, yet it still remains really very much of a fuzzy concept. So we do see a transformation in the Eurosceptic stances. We have seen also what the war in Ukraine has done to Eurosceptic parties' stance towards European integration, and we still need some time, I think, to get to the main effects that the war in Ukraine will have on these Eurosceptic stances, I'd say.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Ben is saying, that basically two things that we need to take into account: the context of all those elections and whether they are elections about Europe. Another example has been the 2018 Italian elections, which were presented as Eurosceptics have won, but the elections themselves were not about Europe. So what are we exactly talking about? And indeed, the other thing is that we've seen since Brexit that on the one hand, support for the EU has actually gone up in a lot of countries. I was looking at some data today, and it said it was Eurobarometer from this winter. There's only 17% of Europeans who have a negative view of the EU. 1/7, you know, it's not a lot. So we've also seen that that whole Brexit thing has led to sort of a counter-reaction, counter-movement, but indeed a lot of Eurosceptic parties trying to reinvent themselves. And I think Le Pen is the best example of this. Others have more or less been sticking to their old tunes, but they also haven't gained more votes. I think a good example is the Netherlands, where we now have 2 Eurosceptic parties, or 3 if you want. But the number of votes they've been having for the last 20 years is more or less the same. If a new Eurosceptic party comes in, they eat into the other parties. So one of the other things also to take into account in this context then is that, you know, it's easy to say there's a rise of Euroscepticism, but we also see quite a lot of countries that there is sort of a threshold where, you know, amount of people that is willing to vote for these parties, which is around 20 to 25%. And yes, there are exceptions to this, but it also means that we need to be careful when you talk about the rise of Euroscepticism, because it's a complex phenomenon. Context matters. And, you know, let's also be honest, there's also 75% of people voting for mainstream parties. Not always because they're happy about mainstream parties, but neither are they about Eurosceptics. And in that sense, I would even say that Euroscepticism, the rise of Euroscepticism, is perhaps even kind of a positive thing, because it also brings in the necessary debate that European integration has been devoid of for most of the time.
Okay, so perhaps I'll say a few words about Central and Eastern Europe, since you, Olga, indicated that's sort of where I'm coming from. I'm Romanian. I've studied in Hungary for a long time, so I'm familiar with the region. And I would say we are so used to speak about Euroscepticism in these terms, the rise of Euroscepticism, boo-hoo-hoo. And no, really, that is it, right? It's always presented as this kind of sort of threats, although no one really defines what kind of threat it is and how it could actually manifest itself concretely. And I think, yes, Euroscepticism is a thing. You can't deny this historically, but I'm not sure that in the past years and in the very recent years, we can really speak of a rise of Euroscepticism. In Central and Eastern Europe, the most evident case of that, if you want to call it like that, is the re-election of Viktor Orban in Hungary. And I must say, it was not, it was a disappointing event for many people who are watching the region, but it was also not unexpected, right? I mean, Hungary is by now quite a special case. This is no longer a free country. I think it's difficult to say it's in a very clear sort of statement like this, but I'm confident to make that statement because it really is not a free country anymore. The Fidesz has been in power for enough time to make institutional structural changes to the institutions of the country, democratic and control institutions of the country, that it is exceedingly difficult for them to actually lose an election, right? So it's a little bit also besides the point. Many people sort of criticize the opposition that they really couldn't get their act together and they were not convincing again. It's a little bit besides the point, in my view, this kind of criticism, because the playground is no longer a fair one. There's really almost no free press left in Hungary, if anybody would be inclined to listen to it anyway. There's massive gerrymandering going on with the electoral laws. There's massive capture of state institutions. So that's Hungary, right? And it is a development that is a long-term development. And what happened now with the re-election of Viktor Orban is not necessarily a surprise, sad as it may be, or disappointing as it may be. What I think it might be interesting, I'm not yet made up in my mind what to think about this, but you were talking, Patrick, about the war in Ukraine and how that might change. Oh, you were talking about, sorry. Let's talk about it. That was my point. Let's talk about it. What is going on with this duo of Hungary and Poland in the wake of the war in Ukraine, right? Because you know, people who are following the sort of this question of democratic backsliding and lack of respect for rule of law in relation to these two countries, right? They are sort of the poster children for misbehaving in the EU. We've always sort of talked about them together as a duo, and also there was this idea that, well, you know, the council won't really do anything serious about this because they will have each other's backs. So you can't really have the unanimity that you need for serious action in this. But I think from the war, since the war in Ukraine, we see that these two friends, let's say, are drifting apart. They have had quite different stances regarding Putin's Russia, very different approaches regarding Ukrainian refugees and how to deal with that humanitarian issue. And also very different approaches regarding the sanctions that the EU keeps imposing on Russia. So, and now, of course, there's this very controversial decision by the Commission to release the recovery funds for Poland, but not for Hungary. So the question is, can we still sort of talk about this duo of Eurosceptics and sort of, yeah, rule of law rogues, let's say, that have each other's backs going forward? Ukraine just became a candidate, not a candidate country, but right, the decision has been taken to open the process for them. This is another area where these two countries were not in agreement. So I think that the future might see, in the future, we might see an important change there that could unlock some development, particularly some leeway for the European institutions to address this question of rule of law, maybe in a more effective way. I'll leave it here and.
Thank you so much. So Indeed, I think you're already touching upon the next question a little bit. What I had in mind is about the challenges that the current situation poses, as you mentioned, Patrick, as well. 25, like if we frame it in the gain way, we will have 75% of people who are actually not Eurosceptic or not voting Eurosceptic. And maybe it's just a normal democratic way also to have this position as well, as a quarter of people voting for Eurosceptic parties. But still, how you see it now, whether you see the specific challenges, you also touched upon the position of Hungary, especially in the discussion of oil and gas, of course. Is it a challenge now for the European Union as a unity, or is it maybe an opportunity as well? And you have diverse opinions. So how do you stand on this? Are they actually challenging the union and the development of the union?
I have to think back about something that Mathieu Segers said yesterday during the panel, right? And he said this is also a moment for European leaders to capitalize on what's going on. And what we see is pretty much support for Ukrainian membership, even though, you know, it's going to take a very long time. We see that one of the old ideas about European integration, namely no more war, is back on the agenda. It's something which has, you know, Dutch politicians were talking about this, you know, it's now about the economy. We don't have to think about these things anymore. And something, you know, the Ukraine war really shows that this is still a relevant thing, and also leads to all kinds of support for European integration in the fields of military and defense and so on and so forth. So I think we're also at a moment which could lead to new development, perhaps a new treaty. I think there's no way around this, although we'll have the problem in particular probably with Orbán, who's probably going to say no to everything. But then it's going to be interesting what the other member states do, because the patience with Hungary is also coming towards an end. So I think we're in a really interesting time in European integration right now, and much more interesting. Brexit was really, you know, as a scholar of Euroscepticism, it's super interesting. Ben and I wrote an article about it together, and we had a lot of fun. And it was really, I think, it was also really interesting to see what was happening. But it was also, no offense to everyone from Britain, but yeah, you know, they were the awkward partner, right? And they've been the awkward partner since the 70s. And we're now in a completely different phase where we shouldn't forget also that most of the people in Hungary and most of the people in Poland are in favor of EU membership. So we're in a completely different situation now. We don't have any member states where there's a large majority, or at least a majority of people being against EU membership. There's mostly broad support for the EU. There are things happening in the world which create a situation which is leading to perhaps further integration, as we've seen with all the major crises in the last 10 years. Some of that integration may have been outside of the EU framework, but it has led to further integration. And I think the challenge is rather going to be in, there's going to be a need for treaty change, I think. You already see this happening. The challenge is going to be, will there be a treaty change, and how will we deal with Hungary, and not so much with Eurosceptic parties in the Netherlands and France and Italy. I think the Italian case, 5-star movement, was just split up, also shows the way in which these things go with Eurosceptic parties. So, but, I think it's a super interesting time to be a scholar of European integration.
Okay, we'll try something. So the question was, how much will Euroscepticism sort of destabilize, is likely to destabilize the European Union coming forward? I sort of agree with Patrick. I think this is not their moment necessarily. Actually, what I want to put on the table, I was thinking about this, reading the classic definitions of populism in the literature. So you know better because you are specialists in this area, but one of the defining elements of populism as a sort of, you know, political movement is this articulation of attention between us, the pure people, and them, the corrupt elites, right? And what I see in my own country, and I think some other places in the region, is, let me just put it out there, pro-European populism. Okay, so we have new political parties, political organizations that have entered the electoral process on a very clear anti-corruption sort of platform. And they absolutely have the discourse of let's be done with the old corrupt elite. They absolutely want to appeal to the people, but they are not the sort of populists you are used to seeing. These are young people, most of them, professionals. They are, in other circumstances, we would call them technocrats. Many of them have work experience or education experience outside the country. And they also don't necessarily appeal to the electorate, which we would normally think of as the sort of the prime ground for recruiting votes for classic populists, right? So people like them vote for this type of movement. Now, in my country, they've been in office for 2 years. They're not doing great, right? The realities of the political system and the political process is getting to erode the idealism of the initial years. And I think what is happening currently with the Bulgarian government is perhaps another example of that. But this is an interesting development because, again, these type of movements are a relatively new phenomenon in the region. They have some elements which could lead us to label them as populists, others which definitely differentiate them for at least a traditional type of populist party. And despite the fact that the performance in office is maybe not that great, I think that they are here to stay. I think that this is more of a long-term change in the political landscape in these countries. You know, maybe they are actually a response also to sort of classic Eurosceptic populism. Perhaps the mistake for traditional parties was not to have the populist element, right? Maybe that's, if you think, I mean, they simply could not appeal to the masses, right? In the same way as Eurosceptic parties. But there's nothing in that methodology to say that you can't apply the same rule book, but to promote European integration and to sort of amp up the advantages that has for the people, for the country, especially in these countries. I think it's not that hard of a sell, right? Because the EU still has this aura of salvation, and that's our future, and this is where we should go. And it can be much more inspirational and convincing than in older member states or in the foundational member states. Yeah, that was my take on it. There you go.
I have the choice between microphones. Is it a press conference? Look, I agree with most of what has been said by my two colleagues here. I'll just bring 2 points to the fore. The first one is, maybe it sounds obvious, but still it's very important to make a distinction between what is populism and what is Euroscepticism, because not all populist leaders and political parties are Eurosceptic, and not all Eurosceptic movements are populist. The same applies to the fact that when we talk about Eurosceptic political movements, we tend to think that we only talk about right-wing, radical right movements, but obviously the radical left also has a strong Eurosceptic component. Now, to get back to your initial question, Olga, when it comes to whether there's a window of opportunity right now that can be sought by the European institutions and mostly the European Commission. I have a bit mixed feelings because of the current political situation we are in right now. I think that the European institutions and European leaders are facing a bit of a difficult situation in which they have to manage expectations ever since the COVID-19 crisis, which we are still in, by the way, we've seen that the expectations of what the European Union has to deliver for its citizens has increased. And that means that even though trust in the European Union has increased quite considerably across the continent, that comes with some expectations or some obligations from the European institutions as well. And that is where there's a big problem that European leaders will be facing. The same applies to giving the official candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. It sets expectations for the Ukrainian people, for the Moldovan people, and they might not be able to deliver. That being said, the European Union is known to muddle through crises. Actually, the European Union has never performed better than when it's under pressure because of multifaceted crises, polycrises in general. It moves on, it moves forward, it makes some political advances when there's a crisis element there. What we see maybe as a distinction with the Great Recession, for instance, and the so-called migration crisis is that the level of opposition to the idea of European integration, so Eurosceptic movements, is not the same as it was nowadays. Probably because the Eurosceptic movements and those promoting Euroscepticism are still trying to find the right strategy to adapt. Finally, referring to the point on treaty changes, I'm not optimistic at all. I don't think it's going to be possible to have treaty changes. I know yesterday that we talked a little bit about the conference on the future of Europe. I think that the political costs that it will entail for some governments are too high. Not that I don't think that it's needed. It's absolutely necessary to have treaty changes. But whether now is the time, I'm not so sure. Maybe after the European Parliament elections in 2024, there may be a window of opportunity depending on how the geopolitical situation evolves and the current crises that we are dealing with too. But I think it will be very difficult to have treaty changes. These were my 5 cents.
Thank you so much. And I think I will continue with the last question from my side, also picking on what you were saying about the differences with the regional differences, and having you been working in Groningen and you came to Maastricht. So basically we have a Dutch old member perspective a little bit. What do you think, like, do we really see differences in electorate and people who are voting, these regional differences that you touched upon as well, in having populist parties? And Vera, I agree with Ben completely, because we quite often forget about extreme left parties that are also populist or Eurosceptic on the different grounds from extreme right parties. So whether you see the regional differences across, I think especially for Andreea, it's easier to compare, but maybe the others could also contribute in the way the people vote or the composition of electorate, whether there are differences across people who identify or as Eurosceptic or vote for Eurosceptic parties.
Okay, thanks, Olga. So I think I maybe answered a few things of this question just in what I said so far. I mean, Patrick, you can correct me, but I think in Central and Eastern Europe, we don't really have that much Euroscepticism at the level of the electorate. Even in Hungary, even in Poland, people are not Eurosceptic, or at least they don't show up Eurosceptic when you ask the kind of Eurobarometer sort of classic questions that measure this. And what might be a sort of a source of Euroscepticism, and this is definitely something that has been exploited by some political actors, is disillusionment with membership in the European Union. You have to understand that these countries acceded to the European Union in a very different way as opposed to the EU 15. And that process created expectations. Benjamin, you were talking about the expectations gap very much here as well, right? These are countries who came out of authoritarian, totalitarian systems of power, right, during the communist times. They underwent sometimes very painful transitions to market economy, functional democracy, and so on. And people expected that once we are in, right, things will be better. And those expectations were not met, or were not met as quickly as some might have expected, and were definitely not met for everyone. A lot of the of intra-EU migration is, you know, a lot of what accounts for that are very poor people from Central and Eastern Europe who come to other richer parts of the European Union and do the jobs that nobody else wants. I don't know if you remember, during the sort of beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was spring, right? And the asparagus was in the fields, and the cherries and the strawberries and everything. And then Western countries found out that there was no one to pick them because the Eastern European workers were under lockdown like everyone else. So special sort of derogations were negotiated to allow for the agricultural sector in Western Europe to actually go on and, you know, provide food to the people who were stuck indoors on the back of Easterners who came to pick the asparagus and so on. Now, I just heard myself making that argument, and that's a perfect populist argument and a perfect Eurosceptic argument as well. So I hope I made the point. The problem is that no one cares about these sort of low-skilled immigrants. Certainly the home, you know, the governments in their own countries don't consider them a problem anymore. They're someone else's problem because they're not in the country to ask for social protection and unemployment benefits and any kind of care and social security from the state, which they wouldn't be able to really provide in a consistent way. They're not the problem of the countries where they go to work either. You know, they're sort of left behind. I think that when we talk about the losers of globalization, losers of European integration, these are the people who have, you know, genuinely lost, genuinely have been left behind. I was reading the other day an article which sort of looked at the, I don't know if you know this term, badanta. It's an Italian term. It means woman who is taking care of elderly people. And this is mostly what sort of low-skilled Romanian women who emigrate to, to Italy, to Spain, etc. This is what they do. They take care of elderly people who sort of move into the houses and they provide care. And a lot of them apparently have left the country also because of economic hardship, but to also escape violent domestic relationships, right? And not that they ended up in a better situation in many cases. No one is taking responsibility for these people. And I think that if there's a threat that we really have to look forward to, not look forward to, but look, be careful about, right? It's these populations that are sort of disenfranchised, and they are a perfect breeding ground for Euroscepticism. And in all honesty, I think it's hard to contend with the fact that they have very legitimate complaints about their situation and their prospects in the EU.
Thank you. Yeah, so when it comes to regional differences, of course, there are plenty of regional differences, but I think that these differences are also like mostly marked about like when it comes to ideological differences. And what we see is that historically, Euroscepticism has been more pronounced, yeah, both on the left and on the right, in countries where either national sovereignty is a very important issue, United Kingdom being an example, but also other countries such as Denmark, and I'll talk about the Danish case in a moment, or where economic anxiety, which is mostly like the left-wing Eurosceptic argument, prevails as well. So we do see different forms, different types of Euroscepticism being advocated in different regions depending on like this cultural and socio-economic argument. As far as I'm concerned, I mostly worked when it comes to Euroscepticism on the Nordic region, and that brings me to the point about Denmark, which is obviously quite fascinating because, as you probably all know, here on the 1st of June, there was a referendum in Denmark on scrapping the defense opt-out, one of the opt-outs that were granted to Denmark following the failed ratification of the Maastricht Treaty initially, and then the negotiation of the Edinburgh Agreement in 1992, which will grant opt-outs to Denmark and also in the UK as part of a parallel process. It's quite telling that such opt-out has been scrapped now, because it's not the first attempt of the Danish government to scrap one opt-out. It's the first time for the defense opt-out. So they tried to get rid of the Justice and Home Affairs opt-out before, and they tried to get rid of the third stage of the Economic and Monetary Union, or the Eurozone opt-out earlier, and it didn't work out because the overwhelming majority of the Danish population believed that Denmark had the best deal on the table with these opt-outs, while successive Danish governments believed it was not the case. And that brings me again to the point that crises can shape the process of European integration. That's why I said a bit earlier also that the European Union is known to muddle through and to perform well under pressure, because it does create, under good circumstances, windows of opportunity to deepen and sometimes maybe correct the course of action when it comes to European integration. The crisis that we see right now is unprecedented, and it does challenge the traditional Eurosceptic rhetoric of national sovereignty, especially in Central and Eastern European member states, because there's a much bigger enemy than an internal one now, that is Russia, and that shifts a little bit the debate, which is also the reason why Eurosceptic movements advocating that right-wing Eurosceptic argument, i.e. the one on national sovereignty, are struggling to adapt to the current situation, which is also possibly, and that would require quite a lot of analysis, but I don't have time to do that right now, so the job is yours in the audience to do this, to see whether actually these traditional right-wing Eurosceptic movements are shifting towards the traditional left-wing Eurosceptic argument by focusing on economic anxiety. We saw this in the French presidential election this year. Marine Le Pen said that she was the candidate for purchasing power, a candidate du pouvoir d'achat in French, which is traditionally like a left-wing kind of argument that angered some of the traditional far-right voters who then voted for Éric Zemmour, who was like the complete extreme of the right side of the left-right spectrum, that is. So we do see a bit of a movement, a metamorphosis of the arguments across different regions, and perhaps for in the foreseeable future, that idea of economic anxiety is going to be the predominant rhetoric for Eurosceptic movements, but only time will tell.
Just want to add two more things. Andreea just talked about legitimate interest, but complaints, and I think this is an interesting thing, because you may see legitimate complaints in different member states, but they may be complaining about different things, but they are legitimate. I think another example is if you look at as Ben called it, the so-called migration crisis. If you were living in Italy and you had all those people, I don't want to make this sound like a problem, but you had people ending up on your beaches and the people in Northern Europe saying, oh, it's your problem. Wouldn't you be skeptical about or critical towards Europe? And I think you see in several member states, there are some different elements of these legitimate complaints that you see arise that explain some of the criticism and some of the hesitation towards the EU. That also makes it interesting, because we're talking about Euroscepticism, but in many ways we're actually talking about valid political arguments to choose perhaps a one-day different Europe, or Europe that pays more attention indeed to economic issues, which, as Ben correctly said, is something that we see now coming up in different member states. And if the war in Ukraine is going to go ahead as it has been going. And we see all the talks already in Germany about a crisis because of gas and stuff like that. This argument may become very important throughout the whole European debate. But indeed, interestingly, what you see is that some way or another, the European Union always manages. And that is strange because every time when there is a crisis, the media say, this is an existential threat to the EU. And all EU scholars say, nah. So you know, you sometimes have the impression that there's something else going on in yeah, whatever the real world is, one of the two, perhaps. But it gives a very strange, to me, a very strange view on it, because on the one hand, it makes something big crisis, whereas it may be a crisis, but with some it's definitely not existential. And on the other hand, this then leads to these popular statements of rising Euroscepticism, blah, 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 blah. And I think one of the things we should all do as scholars of Euroscepticism or scholars of European studies in general, and also simply when you read the news or watch the news or whatever we do nowadays, so maybe you're TikToking the news, I don't know, I'm a little bit older. But I think we should be critical towards what we see and what we read. And I think the good thing is also that you see that more and more people are becoming critical. There's a very good, I think, initiative by some Dutch journalists who work in Brussels, who have set up their own website where they try to give some, you know, yes, these are journalists who write for some of the main Dutch newspapers and for the main Dutch public broadcaster, but there they actually do some, they're not managed by a editor at home who knows shit about the EU. So you actually get some really good stuff there, which is actually worth looking into, and which is also becoming ever more popular. Also to give some context to all of this, but the economy is indeed the key thing that is going to determine EU politics for the next 2-3 years. Ben just referred to the 2024 EP elections. That's just 2 years from now, which means that in a year from now, we'll be seeing the start of all the campaigning, maybe at a very low level, but some of these issues will then have been put on paper by the parties, their party manifestos, party group manifestos, or whatever you have. So it's good to be, I mentioned it earlier, it is really an interesting time for European integration, because I'm not in any way pessimistic about European integration. Even though I said, yes, treaty change, I think we need one, and it might actually happen. I'm also, it's not that I see it happen just like now, but I think maybe that something's going to happen with Hungary, which I think might be interesting. So maybe that's also partly sort of wishful thinking. No offense to anyone in Hungary.
I have a proposal before you take the microphone away from me. Hearing Patrick describe now, you know, other kinds of malcontent in Italy and so on. Let's cancel the term Euroscepticism. Seriously, let's cancel it. It's not useful. It's not useful because it is, I mean, he can talk about this a lot, and when we have before, but it's too broad. And the thing is that it has negative connotations. We are very used to talk about Euroscepticism as the sort of populist nuts, you know, and the kind of Eric Zemmour and Farage of the world and so on. And if we put every complaint that we have about the European Union and European integration under the label of Euroscepticism, what it does is it minimizes it, it discredits it, and it just prevents it from being approached as something legitimate and a genuine problem. I guess the framing is, you know, we keep talking about dangers of Euroscepticism and so on, but this is normal political process, right? These are problems that exist everywhere in the world, and we should not put them here in the EU under this label of, oh, these are just like the woo-woos, and engaged with them in a serious way. Because what you see, the European Commission comes out with these great projects for the people. Oh, we got the unique charger now. Okay, great. And how is this going to help the Italian people who are struggling with migrants, and et cetera, and the truck drivers and the cherry pickers and so on. So, yeah, that was my point. Let's cancel the term Euroscepticism, not the.
Just a quick note on that too. I agree with you. I think that yeah, the term Euroscepticism has a very negative connotation. But when you have a look at, for instance, the European conservatives and reformists in the European Parliament, they try to come up with their own term, knowing that Euroscepticism is too negative, and they call themselves Euro-realists. And then I conducted some interviews with MEPs from the European conservatives and reformists in like 2013, if I remember correctly. And I asked them to provide me with a definition of Euro-realism, and they're like, I don't know, like we are critical of the European Union. So like, well, basically, so you are Eurosceptic. No, like Euroscepticism is like really a negative term, but we really want to contribute constructively to the debates of like European integration. Yet, like the main problem with the notion of Euroscepticism in the academic and public debate is that it's the dominant term now. So there's path dependency, sadly.
Thank you so much. I think after all the conversation so far, we also here should think about how to reframe it in the further academic debates, because of course the definition sticks, and the populism is one of also these catch-all concepts where we often forget that you have a left-wing populism, right-wing populism, and we can see only right-wing dimension of it. So I think this Eurocritics, it's a nice way to say it, but of course it's going to take us a long time of getting change of definitions. But I think the other thing that you highlighted, of course, about the changing nature of the phenomenon, and actually, as we also can argue, we need this for democracy. It is an opportunity also to develop further, to criticize some points, because not all points are out without any reasons where. So it is very interesting how the situation is developing. And I think then, especially given the current situation in the last couple of days, we have lots of participants from different countries where we talked about lots of the impact and current developments and challenges we have. So I think I will now start to open the floor for the questions. I'm pretty sure there are some questions in the audience or comments, and we will try to go around with a catch box and not injure anybody. So please raise your hands. I think so far we have time to ask the questions and get the answers directly. So let's start from the back with Vietnam, and then I will continue with you.
Hi everybody. My name is Yetnor. I come from Albania. We talked a lot about Euroscepticism, or whatever term you want to use, within EU. But what about the growing Euroscepticism outside of the EU? For instance, we have a lot of prospect countries in the Western Balkans. Now we have Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, who wants to join or whatever. If we hear a lot about this Euroscepticism within the EU, then what do you think it will happen to us? In the sense that we want to join, why you guys want to leave? I think there is a growing sentiment against the European Union, especially in the Balkans these days, or particularly in Albania, given the fact that even like yesterday, they still declined us because of the Bulgarian veto or whatever political reason that I'm not that bright to understand. And now we're creating our own, let's say, open Balkans, and saying that, oh, we make our own union, our own trade union with our countries, and then we will let's say compete with the EU, and we don't need the EU or whatever. I mean, I guess this skepticism thingy, it might not be real here in Europe, or the term of canceling or whatever, if you want to do it, but it's actually really real in the region where I come from, because we see it as a beacon of hope, not because it will allow us to access, let's say, benefits of being a European citizen, but the majority of the people are choosing to leave Europe because they want to live in Europe rather than wait for our countries to become like Europe. So I guess it's actually draining us emotionally and economically to that aspect. I don't know who else wanted it.
would you like to, I think we have time to ask questions and answer questions as they come for now. So I would rather prefer this format as far as we don't have so many questions. So I'd like to take this one.
It's interesting that you raised this question, because this morning I was reading the newspaper and there was this article on Ukraine and Moldova, and there was also a comment by, I'm not quite sure whether it was, can't remember exactly whether it was the president or prime minister from Albania or from Northern Macedonia. Yeah, and he said something like, you know, people from Ukraine, it's a great thing, but don't get your hopes up high. And indeed, and I think this links a little bit to what we've just been discussing now also, that there's some kind of expectation from the EU, as Bennett also said it. People are more, trust the EU more, but with more trust also comes more responsibility. And within the EU, this is on a policy level, in countries in the direct neighborhood of the EU, potential member states, it is a much bigger question, namely about being in the club or being outside of the club. And I do agree that if this continues to go like it's going right now, there may also be a backlash in that sense. But you, to some extent, already see in Serbia, right? Indeed, you're absolutely right. And it's maybe a little, but Euroscepticism within Europe or within the EU is indeed shifting a little bit. Outside of Europe, there is indeed a bigger question about membership and these kinds of things, which are very much real also.
Yeah, to add to that, yeah, with great power comes great responsibilities. Yeah, so I think you're raising a very important point here. We have also to think about the potential damages that, let's call it external Euroscepticism, would pose to the European Union. And it's clear that these damages are much lower as these countries are candidates rather than being inside of the European Union. We see what's going on right now with countries that have, yeah, Eurosceptic leaders that manage to block action, for instance. I think also, like the idea that there's a growing sentiment of frustration in these candidate countries, especially in the Western Balkans. I'll put Serbia aside for now because I think Serbia is a bit of a peculiar case. But I think that's also one of the reasons why Emmanuel Macron recycled actually the idea of creating a European political community on the 9th of May. So right after the conclusion of the conference on the future of Europe, saying that basically there should be that big organization with the European family, including countries that are not members of the European Union. You mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned the United Kingdom, North Macedonia, Georgia as well, to coordinate the actions and have a bit of like a political power when it comes to infrastructure, energy, and other issues. It's a very fuzzy idea. It is reminiscent of what François Mitterrand, former French president, wanted with the Confederation of Europe following the fall of the Iron Curtain. But this idea has some potential to manage expectations and to limit the damages that external Euroscepticism may have in the long run for the process of European integration.
First of all, welcome to the Balkans. So it's in a way, I don't think that the issues that we are seeing nowadays are not to be, they could have been foreseen a long time ago. This business with Macedonia and Bulgaria, we knew that they had, you know, some complicated history and demands coming out of that situation. I think this is going to be a big question. I feel like again, the war in Ukraine reopened this question of enlargement. For a long time, enlargement was this lingering process where the EU sort of, okay, will engage with the Western Balkans because we can't just abandon them, but then put no real effort or energy behind that process. So it was this sort of lingering thing. And, you know, quite understandably, these governments in these countries and people in these countries as well grew increasingly frustrated with the dangling of the carrot of EU membership, where you never, you know, get to actually enjoy those benefits. I think now the EU has the opportunity to change the game when it comes to enlargement. There's a new sort of fire underneath this process. And indeed, the big question is, do we still want to go on in the framework of this uniformity ideal where countries have to meet a certain standard, they are assessed to death until we are super sure that they meet the standard, maybe they never will, and then they're let into the club? Or do we want to have a kind of second tier of not member countries, but maybe associate countries or friends, political friends of the EU, or so whatever you want to call it, friends of the EU, where these countries can still, you know, they can still claim that they get something, but it's not the full membership. Now, you know, this is an idea that has potential, but it also has disadvantages. I can see how this can degenerate into this sort of quarantine zone where we put all the countries that have some kind of democratic deficit problems and corruption problems and so on. And then, you know, would there be a mechanism to become, you know, graduate from the friend of the EU to a full member state and so on? So, you know, there's a lot of questions to be asked here, but I think we have an opportunity to finally restart the process of enlargement, or sort of reopen these questions that have been, frankly, neglected over the past few years.
Thank you so much. So we will continue with two further questions that they had. One more afterwards.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I'll raise a few points. So number one, we didn't really define the term Euroscepticism. So it could refer to very rich countries or regions which would like to separate because they think they would be better alone, like the UK, but then it's Scotland, Catalonia, or separate regions within countries. Or we have poor countries which think that they will become even poorer after they join, or they already joined and they feel that they became poorer. And I'll give you an example of Bulgaria about this. I come from Bulgaria, I studied in Hungary. So related to skepticism in these two countries, it's not exactly skepticism, but it is for Hungary, for example. The country is trying to promote some ideas which are not very popular by the rich countries in the EU. And that's the reason why it is blamed. In Bulgaria, there is a similar issue, but just the government doesn't express it. However, it appears among the people, and a clear example of this is agriculture. Bulgaria can produce very good fruit, vegetables, a lot of agricultural products. And since it is a member of the EU, it exports high quality agricultural products at a very low price. And now it imports very low quality agricultural products from other countries. And the population is very dissatisfied with this. And it's a very small issue which raises the Euroscepticism. Last point, who is to blame? So the responsibility comes by whom? And here we spoke about Albania. Bulgaria didn't put a veto on Albania, but on the Republic of North Macedonia. And if Albania applies alone, maybe it will not have a veto, but this means more responsibility for Albania to follow the rules. So maybe this is related to it. And yeah, here is, that's all. Thanks.
Whoa, I don't want to take the microphone for this question. Not yet.
I'll start.
Yeah.
I'll try. It's going to be quite brief. Yeah, when it comes to the definition of Euroscepticism and what it is all about, I mean, like I always use Paul Taggart's definition of contingent or qualified opposition to the process and ideas of European integration. Taggart, 1998, a touchstone of dissent. That's the encompassing definition of Euroscepticism, of course, but there are a lot of shades of Euroscepticism, as you demonstrated right here. Now, to the big question that you raise, who is to blame? I think that there's shared responsibility all around by all actors, not only like at the European level, but at the domestic level, civil society as well. I'm quite passionate about this idea that my main issue, and that can be very easily fixed in my view, is the issue of communication. The majority, like education, communication and education, that is. It would be very easy to set up across the European Union and maybe even beyond, kind of like an information course or leaflet for children, not propaganda, I want to make it clear, but about what is the European Union and what it does and does not do for its citizens. Because it's still very much for the ordinary citizen, a bit of that weird black box. And that's also the reason why the Eurosceptic argument of these like overpaid bureaucrats living in the Brussels bubble is still predominant and still resonates with some voters, because they don't know how it works. They don't know what the European Union does for their countries, for their generations, for their families in general, and the opportunities that they may get from them, because not everyone also will seize the opportunities provided at the individual level by the European Union. So yeah, responsibility is to be shared, but solutions can be easily provided, I think, by the European institutions, or parts of the solution at least.
I don't believe in Ben's solution. It's funny because Ray and I have had this discussion before. I don't think that this is going to be helped by a campaign or a leaflet or stuff like that. I think we should blame some people, and if there are people we should blame, it's probably national politicians who play this blame game and who act as if there's an ongoing war in Brussels where you win some, and if you lose, it's someone else to blame. And I think as long as that is not, if there's not a slightly different take on this, the next leaflet is not going to help. I remember the 2005 referendum campaign here in the Netherlands. Most beautiful leaflets, but people still fell for the sort of the stuff that happened right before. And the year before, the Dutch had the EU presidency, and their slogan for the EU presidency was the EU, kind of important. And we had politicians saying stuff like the EU is too expensive, the EU is too this, the EU is too that, and all of a sudden in 2005 they had to say, it's very important that you vote for this treaty. We need this constitution. And then it went further and further, because at one point they were saying, if you don't vote for the constitution, we will have a war. Lights will go out. And I think there's, as long as they don't change their rhetorics, and it's okay to say the French wanted this and we wanted this, and but just constantly this thing, I don't think is going to help, and I don't think that an information campaign is going to help, because it will not be picked up. And it will not be seen, because it also needs then, you'd almost need to write in that little leaflet sort of a disclaimer, don't believe your national politicians. And I find it very complicated to see communication. We had around that same time, we had the Barroso Commission with Wallström, who was doing actually a really good job, I think, in many ways, trying to build up some kind of information and communication policy within the EU. But I was doing interviews back then for my PhD thesis, and I remember some people just saying, yeah, she can do whatever we want, but my Italian head of DG just tells us to ignore it. And so all of this stuff is not, I don't think it will stick. I'm sympathetic towards the idea, but it will always, I think it will always be seen as something which is propaganda, even though it's not meant to be. And it will never fall where we want it to fall when national politicians still distort the picture of what happens in Brussels. And so do the media. Yeah. No, that's what also I also, earlier when I said the media will paint this picture of every crisis being an existential crisis. It's complete nonsense, but it creates an image or sort of a discussion where any good, well-meant initiatives just never really get there. And, then when it comes to education, let's be quite honest, I think most people in Europe nowadays are very well educated. They may not all be at university, but if you compare education at lower levels to what it was like 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's also higher. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this, but I sympathize with the idea. I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, well, I think maybe the real danger is not that people don't know that much about the EU, but that they can believe anything, so danger is disinformation, actually, right? Fake news, etc. We live in this era, and the less you know about a certain subject, the more vulnerable you are to fake news. I think the European Commission certainly is aware of the problem, tries to do something. I doubt that it's going to be terribly effective, to be honest, but it is an issue that sort of compounds the problem by a lot, to be honest.
Thank you so much. And I think we have time for one more question at least. Let's see how it goes. Maybe.
Great. Thank you so much. As far as I can see, you are very excited about this family around Europe, political community. Now, as coming from Macron, it signals to me something pretty risky, and I'm interested in your opinions, whether this family could not be his new variant of Europe with several speeds, whether it is not one room meant to lock there all the countries that he doesn't want in the European Union, just to tell them, okay, you are our friends, but I will definitely forget you there. I will give you from time to time some candies, but you will stay there. And I'm afraid it's pretty risky. I would not be that enchanted with such a proposal.
Just react quickly on the matter. Yeah, I agree. And that proposal from Emmanuel Macron raises more questions than answers, of course. I mean, I'll do a little bit of self-promotion. I don't want you to buy the book, but because it's far too expensive, it's for libraries. But I recently co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Differentiation in the European Union, which covers quite a bit about this. And Sven and I co-authored a chapter in this volume, where we talk about like these ideas and the dangers, the risks and opportunities that differentiation entails. So differentiation being like, well, you don't give the same status. Like, well, I'm summarizing a little bit, but to all countries, which is basically the risk that you are highlighting right here. I think that for this idea to work, you need to set clear-cut rules on who makes the rules, what kind of political representation there will be as well, and avoid at all costs any cherry picking from any side. So from the European Council side, for instance, or Macron's side, if you like, or from the countries that want to move up and down the levels of like a Europe of variable geometry, which is basically what it is all about. So that's why it raises more questions and answers. It's been very, very briefly discussed in the European Council Summit yesterday. It seems that they started discussing the matter, but honestly, I don't think that Macron will manage to get what he wants in these 5 years, because it's far too complex, it's far too complicated. There are far too many issues at stake, and people will think that it's again like Mitterrand's idea, which was a complete failure in the early 1990s.
well, I think it was obvious from what I said that I share very much your skepticism about this idea, but I don't think we're in a good situation with the uniformity ideal either, right? Because we are very often in deadlock situations, and I don't think that every difficult partner within the EU will have a Brexit, right? So this will be permanent problems that will have to be dealt with. There's no, I can't say what the good answer to this is. I more dislike than like the idea, if I'm honest, but I can't give an alternative that is, yeah, that is concrete. Yeah.
Let's do another question.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more question, for the last question. Okay, Phyllis, we will try to throw you a box.
I would like to ask one question regarding to the common security and defense policy. You have already mentioned about the crisis is shaping the European Union response, especially in terms of the last crisis regarding Ukraine and also the other crisis. And you also said lately Denmark has opted out. And I'm questioning myself, on the one hand, they would like to accelerate the common security, you know, the strategic compass, European peace facility. But on the other hand, we have seen the rising of Euro-realism, not Euroscepticism. Also, the public opinion is not supporting in some parts of the common security, such as, I'm not talking about European army or other stuff. How the European Union is going to survive according to you? Because as far as I see, I'm always referring to the Ukraine crisis. We have seen the return of the US. What do you think about that? Because they say US is always there, US is always there for us, and Europe's failure again, I see. For the second Ukraine, now the Ukraine war, of course. I'm not talking about 2015 Ukraine conflict. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer again. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the strategic compass, I think it's overdue. I think that it was high time that the European Union tries to, deepen the common security and defense policy. Now the final shape that it's going to take, and whether that strategic compass will be successful, no idea. I am sympathetic of the idea of what you said, that public opinion is quite divided over the issue of like deepening security policy. Now, going to be a bit cynical here, but does it really matter? In the sense, it does matter for the legitimacy of the European Union, absolutely. But it's always like, I'm going to take a very weird parallel here, but it's also at the domestic level, comparing this to public opinion on whether like the public supports sanctions against Russia that will hit them from an economic perspective. It's a decision to be taken by the people who are directly elected, rather than letting public opinion shape this. I mean, when it comes to the strategic compass, I think that it's not going, we are far from the idea of a European army. I think that it's not going to happen soon, but there are some strong elements in the strategic compass that demonstrate that the deepening of the common security and defense policy is proportionate to the new developments that are occurring. So therefore, I think that, yes, we see that public opinion is divided on the matter, but it should not have serious consequences on the legitimacy of the European Union, should it be fully implemented and successful.
The interesting thing with this topic is also that you've seen quite a lot of member states, governments moving on this in the last couple of months. You know, the Dutch government, the new Dutch government, new 5 months old, but relatively new Dutch government took quite a different position on all of this as compared to the previous one, even though the previous one is actually the same as the current one. I think governments are now moving and warming up to the idea of a stronger joint EU policy. I think the whole thing that we see happening indeed with rising defense expenditures is leading to a new situation. I also think at the same time, if I think back of Eurobarometer opinion polls and this and that, I remember once reading something where someone said, in many ways, the EU is a federation turned upside down. Why? Because all the things that would normally be at the level of a federation is decided upon member state level. Defense, economy, monetary policy. Well, there we've already seen changes. And on the other hand, all the stuff that you would normally do at regional level is decided by the EU. Agricultural policy is one of the things that you often, why is this still an EU policy in the way that it is, right? So I'm less, I think actually people might support more EU involvement in this. But in certain, I think the idea of a European army, the whole idea of an army, one of my master's students is writing about this at the moment. She has to hand in her thesis next week. And it's quite interesting what she finds. And one of the things is what you see is that as soon as you stay away from the idea of an army, which means you send people somewhere and they can die, the idea of further European integration in this field becomes something which is more acceptable also at popular level. I think here is very much also what do these things mean? As Ben said, the strategic compass is quite an interesting document, also prepared to all these previous security strategies, which were a lot of blah, blah, blah stuff. But I think you see both the more skeptical governments from the past, plus some of the people moving towards a new reality. And again, only because we're in that crisis. It is maybe one of the more trickier issues, but just like we've seen in the Great Recession, where all of a sudden thinking about joint policies is possible, where we've had the Corona crisis, where the idea of Eurobonds, which was, we shall not call them Eurobonds, but we have Eurobonds now. It's a different name, and everyone is okay with it, well, more or less everyone. So, and I think this might also happen with this. I think things are moving more rapidly because of the crisis, and different labels can also make things more acceptable within certain boundaries. That's absolutely true. It would be weird if von der Leyen phones me and says, "Thou shalt now go to Ukraine to fight." But that's not going to happen. This kind of a European army, military cooperation, etc., etc.
We have time for yeah, well, what can I say? I've always found this question of more defense cooperation a strange one to ask in the context of the EU, because the EU, the European Union, is a peace project. I can't imagine the European Union at war, right? Probably what we have now is the most we've ever had in the history of the EU. I don't know if anything we've done in the Cold War can actually compare. So I think many other things would have to be rethought and reinvented in order for this to make sense for the European Union, right?
Thank you so much for all your questions. And I think big thanks from all of us for your insights and coming here to Maastricht. And wrapping up the whole thing, actually, it's the last session. So we asked ourselves the question of Maastricht at 30, being here in Maastricht, what next for Europe? And I think especially this roundtable showed us that we have some quite optimistic prospects, though we are living in a very challenging and interesting times. And I would like to encourage you to give a round of applause for our speakers and also for all of you as well for presenting here. Thank you so much.